everyone, and welcome to the Love of Wisdom Book Club. This episode was recorded remotely with my brother Thomas Carling, and we spoke about Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. A couple of things to note. One, there is a little bit of issue with the video recording as I do not appear on the screen for the first minute or so. I don't know why this is. It hasn't happened on any of my other recordings. It's just this one. But hopefully it's for such a short period of time that it shouldn't have too much impact on the viewing experience. And equally, towards the end, there are some technical issues on my brother's side that create a little bit of audio distortion that only lasts for a few seconds and then disappears. So hopefully that doesn't impact too much either. In terms of the book itself, I thoroughly recommend it to anyone, whether you are interested, whether you're academically inclined or not. It's not an academic book. It's a story of one man's experience in the concentration camps, bringing his psychotherapeutic lens to that experience, and it gets referenced frequently by people because of the profound impact that the ideas and stories and concepts have on people. It's also quite, although it can be quite a harrowing read at times, it's quite an easy read in that it's not a very long book and you can get sucked into it. It's not overly taxing to read it. I think I've listened to it on audiobook and I've read it through twice, and both readings took me maybe 10 hours in total, over the course of 2 or 3 days. So it was very easy to get through very quickly. You can pick it up very cheaply, and yeah, well worth a read. And I hope that this conversation is of value to people listening to it. As is always the case, the book is an anchor to the conversation and we keep coming back to it, but we also go off on tangents about our own lives and how the messages in the book relate to those. But we also speak about other books and other ideas that are linked from other places and try and tie that all in. So the book remains an anchor for a more broad discussion. And without further ado, I will leave you to listen to it, and I hope you enjoy. So, Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. What did you think of it?
It was interesting. To be fair, with the stuff about the actual concentration camps, none of it really surprised me too much. But it was quite interesting to see the sort of like psychiatric review of everything, and there's definitely some bits that I didn't expect. But yeah, it was a very interesting read. There's a few bits that definitely made me question like the sort of way that I went about life, and also made me realize a lot of where my depression and stuff was coming from. Obviously from the title Man's Search for Meaning, it's a lot of people lack meaning sort of situation, and I didn't realize that that's probably a large part of where my depression came from originally. So it was insightful, to say the least.
Okay, that's interesting. So I would agree that the fact that he was a psychotherapist prior to being detained in a concentration camp, for any listeners who haven't read the book, Viktor Frankl was a Jewish psychotherapist who was detained in a concentration camp, or several concentration camps in Nazi Germany, over an extended period of time. His wife was also detained, and he effectively wrote this book about his experiences in that time period. So yeah, like you said, he brings a psychotherapist's lens to it and is sort of looking at things from that angle. And but there's also a moral element, I would say, to it, and in that regard it reminds me in many ways of the Gulag Archipelago by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, which I think you started reading. I'm not sure if you finished it or not. No. You haven't. That's
Oh,
fine.
yeah.
So, but you found a real life application to it straight away then, and what did that look like then? So you felt that your depression stemmed from a lack of meaning, is what I'm gathering.
A large part of it. Obviously, there's other things as well, but I think that probably played a big part.
Okay, and so what do you feel that your life has meaning now?
It's getting there.
It's getting there.
um, I feel like I have a lot more of an idea of where my life is heading and what I actually want to do with it. I wouldn't say I'm where I want to be, but I suppose that's kind of life's journey anyway. Are you ever really exactly where you want to be? Um, and yeah, it's but what was the question again?
So I was just asking if you felt you had meaning now, and I guess you're sort of saying that you're on a journey towards something. Um, I would say from reading the book and more generally that the journey is where the meaning is derived from to some degree. I think I don't have this quote to hand, but I remember reading within the book he spoke about the need for tension, and he basically said when man is in a state of equilibrium or homeostasis, the idea that people often think we're pursuing is this state of equilibrium where we have what we want, we continue with everything sort of the same, and we're happy within our life. But um, it reminds me of Fyodor Dostoevsky's Notes from the Underground Man, or Notes from the Underground, sorry. And the Underground Man within that says basically that if humans were given everything they need, so that all he had to um, occupy himself with was eating and pleasure and everything like that, then he might be happy for a few days, but the next thing he'd do is smash everything to pieces because he would have to prove to himself that he has agency over his own life. Basically, he would get bored and he would feel he was just going through the motions if he was in this state of homeostasis. Whereas Viktor Frankl phrases it as meaning coming from that tension between being where you are now and needing to be somewhere else, and there always has to be a tension between sort of what you have and what you don't yet have. So
Yeah.
do you feel that having a are you saying that having a journey that you're on and something that you're aiming towards is your source of meaning, or because it also you were phrasing it in a way that sounded like you said you felt like you were building towards meaning. So I'm just wondering which way you see it at present.
Yeah, you know what? I haven't actually given it that much thought, but it. I suppose there is a massive amount of meaning coming from the journey I'm on.
Yeah.
So you've got the element of like getting healthy and like getting my mind better and things like that. And it's definitely showing me like there's more to life than just comfort, which has been interesting. But yeah, I suppose there's different areas of meanings. In the book, he basically says that meaning is transitionary and it will never be exactly the same for one person throughout their life, and it will change at different points. And I think I can see where there's going to be meaning in the future of my life, and at the minute, the meaning is sort of like getting towards the another meaning, which
Yeah.
yeah, it's basically like part of the journey at the minute, and but then I can also see like deeper meaning in my life like later on. Basically, that's the sort of way I'm looking at it.
Okay, and what is it that you envision yourself deriving meaning from in the future?
Well, it's always been a case of, as you know, I love animals and I love helping people. So it's just getting to a point where I can do exactly that and help people as much as I can, and hopefully at some point start a few different like animal charities, or like work towards making money enough to donate and be active within like different charities and things like that.
Okay, so that reminds of a quote that I have actually got to hand, just because of from the book, just because of how you're framing that sense of meaning. I think it's salient, and it's a man who becomes conscious of the responsibility he bears towards a human being who affectionately waits for him, or to an unfinished work, will never be able to throw away his life. He knows the why for his existence and will be able to bear almost any how.
Yeah,
And that it's also, I mean, Frankl does quote Nietzsche within the book at some point, but a man who has a why can bear any how is a Nietzschean dictum from um, that is very famous. And so you, if I'm right, you're describing your current source of meaning as a progression towards a goal, a sort of journey of self-improvement, which will enable you to better yourself and allow you to be in a position to be in service to others. Would that be a fair summary of what you're saying?
yeah, I would say so. So like the way I see it is, although I don't think people need to be perfect to sort of like help other people and stuff like that, and to the sort of level I want to do it, I feel like I definitely need to build myself as a person and be in a better position. Because like I don't see me being like, obviously I haven't been drinking or anything much for a while, but if it's say like 9 months or a year ago when I was drinking all the time and still taking drugs and that, I wouldn't see myself being in any sort of like reliable position to be able to like help people like consistently, or even like I feel like I'd probably end up in a situation where I'd probably screw it up and make it worse for people. So the goal is to sort of get myself to make myself reliable so I can like sort of yeah, to sort of show up for myself, and then I can start doing it for other people. There's also an element of like I want to be in a position where I am comfortable and I can live comfortably while I'm sort of like helping people. So it's sort of like sorting my life out, and then I'm able to sort other, well, not sort other people's lives out, but help in some way or another, and animals as well, obviously.
Always the animals. Um, well, I heard an economist say recently, and I can't remember who it was, so unfortunately I can't give him credit for this. But they said um, that wealth is basically free time.
Yeah,
And what they meant by that, they elaborated to basically say that having more money enables you to have more time to make more money and to do more productive things. And that was true. Well, it's always been true as long as we've had means of utilizing anything other than self-sustenance or self-sustaining um, measures. So, like one of the very primitive forms of wealth in that regard would be the capacity to own slaves. And owning a slave meant that the slave did the work that would be time consuming for you in order to survive. And you were then had free time to focus elsewhere on accruing wealth and so on.
yeah,
And obviously, over time, I mean, I'm about two-thirds of the way through The Rational Optimist by Matt Ridley, which gives a history of many sort of innovations throughout human history that have enabled us to thrive, really. And the last chapter I read, I think, was called the release of the slave or something along those lines. I might be getting the wording slightly wrong, but basically he showed how we were able to stop using slavery because, I mean, the end to slavery is more complicated than this, but one of the key points of the end of slavery was that we had beasts of burden, so oxen and horse, who could then be used to plough land and transport goods, and this enabled people to be more efficient with what they were producing and enabled people to have more free time and develop more wealth without exploiting other human beings, because the exploitation of human beings became more expensive and less efficient than the use of animals. And then we progressed on from the use of animals for the large, I mean, I'm talking in general terms because slavery and the use of animals as beasts of burden exists sort of all over the world still. But we then moved on to machinery, basically, hydroelectrics and other forms of power. And then gradually we got to the point we're at now, where, without getting into the whole environmentalist thing, which is an entirely different topic, we are now able to generate an insane amount of power using very little land space and very little resource compared to what we would have been able to before. And that enables us to use things like the laptop or the computer we're using now, our mobile phones, all these amazing innovations that we have. And I read this amazing statistic recently with regards to electricity production, which was that in 1950, it was to generate 1 hour's worth of lighting. So like for your house, for example, used in 1950 would cost 3 hours of the average wage, whereas now it costs less than a second of the average wage, which is pretty remarkable.
Yeah.
So you are referring this back to what you said originally. You're in a position now where you are accumulating that wealth or working on accumulating that wealth. And I don't just mean wealth in a financial sense. I mean wealth in a, you are looking after your health better, therefore you're able to be more productive with your time. You're going to spend less time ill, and therefore that enables you to have more free time. So health is an economic resource in that regard. Also, better mental health is going to make you more productive, more focused. You're going to spend less time lying in bed or getting wasted or whatever it is that mental health impact tends to manifest itself as. So you're on this journey of wealth accumulation to enable you to have that time to use your time for something that you're passionate about, but you're just on that journey. Am I making sense? Is that a fair summary?
That's a very long way round to get to it, but yeah, that is essentially it. And it's I suppose it's like, no matter what like milestones you hit, you're always gonna have to keep creating new goals and keep moving forward and doing all that. So it's an element of having like small steps that give you meaning towards your life. And then exactly what it says in the book, when you start having meaning and you start having reason to do something and reason to live, then it's just like you can bear any what was it is
you can bear anyhow.
That's it.
Like, you can bear anyhow.
Yeah, that's the one.
So I mean, I can see the same thing in my own life. I suffered from a lack of direction and meaning for a very long time, and I I attempted to find other sources of meaning, and I derived them from, I guess, unconventional ways, and that lack of a clear meaning and sense of responsibility enabled me to get captured in ideology, because I derived my sense of meaning and belonging from an ideological viewpoint. Um, and it's been and when I did that, I mean, in some ways it would be the worshipping false idols concepts that you see in Christianity. I was pursuing the wrong goals that were derived on ideology, right? And what would happen is, because they weren't inherently meaningful and they were somewhat corrupting, that my resilience and my psychological state and my emotional well-being would go up and down and up and down, and I wouldn't be able to find any sort of sustainable stasis in some ways, or not stasis, but equilibrium of some description. But then I try to think what point in my life exactly this happened, but probably it's such a gradual, incremental process. And I've heard earlier today, actually, I was listening to a neuroscientist whose surname I can't remember, but his first name was Carl, speaking with Lex Friedman. And he was saying he'd recently discovered, because he's not a philosopher, he'd recently discovered the philosophical concept of vagueness, which is basically that things don't have lots of things don't have clear boundaries. And so for me to say that where a point is in my life where I had found that sense of meaning in a genuine and less corrupt manner than I had done previously, to say exactly where that point is, there's no guarantee for that. And the example he used to illustrate vagueness was, how many grains of sand do you need before you can consider it a pile? Because there's no strict rule to that, is there? And it's like,
No.
at what point is someone bald? When they only have half a head of hair? When they have, like, I watched some of the ceremony for the Queen's funeral earlier, and I was looking at Prince William, and I think most people would consider him bald, but he has quite a lot of hair on the sides and the back. So that's another example of that concept of vagueness. Does he have hair or is he bald? Because he's not 100% bald.
It's definitely like on the top of the head though. If you have hair on the side, then you're bald in it. It's just the top of your head. If you have hair on the top of your head and not the sides, you're not going to be considered bald, are you? So
no, but that doesn't mean that the correlative is true. But I understand what you're saying, and I think most people would classify him as bald, but that indicates an inherent uncertainty to it, because the definition of bald would be lacking hair, and he clearly has hair.
yeah.
So anyway, it's just an analogy, an example to analogize it. But so for me, it was something like finding a job that I felt was in service to others when I started doing support work, that I could see my own potential for growth in. I felt like I was utilizing my abilities. I felt like I had to deal with a certain amount of difficulty. I mean, a significant amount of difficulty in many ways, but it was all in service of something. There was always a clear goal and a clear purpose to that, and so that started to help me formulate a true moral source of meaning, which is, you know, to taking responsibility and self-development. And that has been able to be built on and built on and built on, and it's turned itself into, you know, looking after myself physically, looking after myself, you know, exercising, nutrition, sleep, rest, meditation, but also this continued push for self-development. And it's that tension that Viktor Frankl spoke about, of the knowing you are, the tension between who you are now and who you could be. And I feel like I'm constantly wrestling with that tension, and that because I spent, well, I spend pretty much every waking minute doing something to be trying to better my, whether it's reading or listening to podcasts or watching lectures or exercising or any other things that I listen to. It's always sort of in pursuit of this. I could be more than I am now, and although that can be tiring at times, I would say that it's enabled me to have a more sustained. I very, very rarely struggle with low emotion for any sustained period of time, and even in very chaotic and challenging situations that leave me sort of tired. I mean, I had an incident at work a few weeks ago that I can't, obviously I can't go into too much detail because it's confidential, but there was a crisis with a child that required that we forced entry into someone's house with the police. And this went on for a number of hours. We arrived at 10 in the morning, and I didn't leave that house until 5:30 at night. So I was there for 7.5 hours, give or take. And in that time, I hadn't eaten before I went in. I didn't eat while I was there. I wasn't able, like, I did manage to sneak to the toilet once in that time, but like, for that whole 7.5 hours, I was dealing with something, and there was a lot of responsibility and a lot of stress because we had to make sure this child was okay. But I was able to remain calm throughout it because there was a clear meaning and purpose to what I was doing, and I finished. And although I was hungry and a bit tired, I went home, I got some food, and then I went out and carried on with everything else that I would had to do, because there's something inherently sustaining in that responsibility and pressure there.
Yeah. Would you say that when you were searching for meaning before you got this job, and in your like Marxism phase and all that sort of stuff, would you say that you were sort of like looking for meaning within other people's meaning rather than looking for your own? So you're looking for someone else to give you meaning rather than finding meaning within yourself? Because I felt like I was sort of doing that when I was a bit younger. And to be fair, I didn't really like, I wasn't consciously thinking that like I needed to find meaning or anything like that. But it was sort of like, it is evident that I wanted to be something, and I was sort of looking for shortcuts to sort of do it without thinking about it. So yeah, it wasn't until that I actually was in a situation where I had to sit there and think like, what is the point of my life, that I actually started leaning towards figuring out something for myself. So would you say it's the same for you?
That's a really good question. um, I think there was definitely a social element to it. I mean, in some ways, I dislike using this term, um, because I feel like it has an inherent negative connotation to it that makes it sound a bit like an accusation. And I don't really consider it an accusation, but in some ways, I feel like I was groomed into that ideological way of thinking. I was a willing participant in that, but like, when I um because we moved around a lot, obviously, when we were younger. Um, you probably less so than me, because I think we were more settled by the time you were born. But you know, although I had a fairly settled friend group through primary and secondary school, um, there were changes, and then we moved to England. And I think when we came to England, there was an element of naivety on my part, um, because I wasn't used to the big bad world in that was because we'd lived in a more quiet and rural part of the world. And although I spent plenty of times in the towns of West Cork, they didn't compare in their scale and
Yeah.
and the opportunities that present themselves in the UK. So then I think that moving at that key sort of developmental stage um, meant that I was having to do a lot of adapting, and I was sort of always I was looking for friends and friendship groups, um, and that sense of belonging, really, I guess. And I think that need for a sense of belonging may also come from an absence of meaning. Um, and I think there was a directionlessness, because I wanted to do music, but I wanted to do music because that was all I'd ever known. And actually, when you look at what I did, my interest was less in music than the surrounding um, the surrounding culture of the music. Like I went to college at 16 to do music, but I pretty much just spent that 2 years taking drugs and playing the odd bit of music here and there. And so it was that lifestyle, that associated lifestyle, that was appealing to me. Um, but it wasn't something that I derived any sense of meaning or purpose from. And so then when I went to university to study music, that wasn't a considered decision as such. Like, I probably spent some time considering it, but I feel like it was more of a just, well, I did music already, so I may as well carry on to music, and I didn't get on at school, so it's not like I'm going to change into anything. And I think part of it, I've thought about this for a very long time. I feel very, although I have no bitterness or resentment over it, I feel like I have a good idea of how much potential I had as a child. Um, and I don't feel that the school system really harnessed that very well, because they didn't give me any ideas. There was never any discussion of the future, or what we might want to be, or what the options that were available were. Um, and that might be a reflection on the culture there, where there's very high unemployment and limited opportunities. Um, but I'd never heard of fields like psychology when I was choosing what to go to university for. And
Yeah.
whether or not that would have changed my perspective at that time, I don't know. It's, you can't figure these things out. But I didn't know what there were many things that would have interested me, I think, that I could have derived a source of meaning from, but instead I was just sort of going through the motions and doing what I wanted, because I'd sort of boxed myself in to some degree. And then when I went to university at 18, that's when the lack of meaning and the lack of a sense of belonging, because I moved again. I'd only been settled in one place for 2 years, and then I moved again, and then I was starting again, and that lack of meaning and that lack of sense of belonging left me primed for any group of people who are willing to take me on board. And I was pretty rebellious. I was into punk music, so there was lots of stuff in place already. And then when I came across the more ideological side of life with there was lots of Marxist influence. There was it was mostly anarchists and activists and that sort of crowd that appealed to me at that point in time. And I actually have a theory that I'm working on. I've been writing about it, trying to sort of pin it down exactly, but I'll come back to it. But basically, like, I was a completely willing participant in this, but I entered into this community that was basically like everything was based around this ideology. It was everyone was deriving their sense of identity from their commitment to an ideology. All of the books, all of the music, all of the conversation was all about this ideology, and it appealed to me. But I realize now that to some degree we were all facilitating this self sort of, it was all so it's not like there was a conscious effort of grooming on their part, because they were all caught up in this same ideology, but we created an environment that sort of sucked people in and exploited that lack of meaning in their lives. So whether I got that meaning from other people or not, I was doing a poor job of thinking for myself, that's for sure. But I was presenting it under the guise of thinking for myself. And it was a sort of question everything attitude that led me there. But that question everything was stopping at a certain point where we didn't question the dominant ideology within that community. And my theory of this is sort of, it draws on a mixture of Sigmund Freud and Jean Piaget. And Jean Piaget was a developmental psychologist who basically outlined some key stages of development as he saw it. And some of the characteristics, particularly of childhood, were egocentrism, but he still considered that to be a present characteristic during late adolescence, which is basically the sort of, we have lots of sayings related to it, don't we? That the arrogance of youth and teenagers thinking they know it all and all of this. And he also spoke about them at that stage, people having grand and idealistic views. And I think that at that, there's a key stage of development between there and the next stage, where you have this belief that at that age that the world must adjust itself to accommodate you. And some people might think of it as like a Peter Pan type scenario. It's like, I don't need to grow up. I don't need to take more responsibility. The world is unfair because the world doesn't let me just do what I want. And that's sort of like an underpinning philosophy to a lot of this. And I've seen it in so many different people, and not least myself. But and then you sort of slowly come out of that, and you realize actually the world is bigger than me. I'm just one person, in part of a family, in part of a community, in part of some of these institutions, in part of society, in part of culture, in part of a country, in part of the world. And there's all these different layers at which you are part of something that is far bigger than you. And for the world to continuously adjust to every individual would be completely impractical, and would it would cease to function. And so I think that activism is possibly a healthy. There's a stage in your life where adopting that activism is not necessarily a concern in and of itself, because it's a part of that key developmental stage. And although not everyone goes through it to the same degree or in the same forms, But Freud also had the idea of fixation, which is that people get stuck at one developmental stage in their life and they um, don't progress past it. And to me, there are, and I see this in people. I'm quite glad I don't see it in myself anymore. But once you go past a certain stage, I think people can get developmentally fixated in this stage of egocentrism and expecting the world to adjust to them, and that is basically the meaning of the story of Peter Pan, the boy that wouldn't grow up. um, and and it leads to a lot of misery and unhappiness, because they constantly feel hard done by, they feel like a victim, they feel like the world isn't accommodating them, and they feel ostracized and on the margins and all these things that are quite difficult. And perhaps there's reasons why they're on the margins anyway, or why they feel left out of society, and why they have difficulties that contribute to this. But yeah, that's sort of a theory that I've been working on, that I um, may still be full of holes, but I'll be curious to hear what you think of it, seeing as I've just told you about it for quite a while.
The one thing I was going to comment on was the what you're saying about how a lot of people do get stuck in that sort of phase of believing that the world should sort of be how they expect it to be. It's becoming, from my experience anyway, obviously I wasn't alive before I was born and stuff like that, but it seems like it's becoming a lot more common. It may be due to social media and things like that, but it is definitely like evident in like a lot of online forums, or like things like Tumblr or Instagram and stuff like that. People just try and find any reason to be the victim, and then you've got all this thing about like trigger warnings and stuff like that. Like if you accidentally trigger someone's like traumatic response, even though like it's perfectly healthy for people to be exposed to like fucking things. In fact, it's probably like one of the most effective ways, exposure therapy, for dealing with trauma. Is like you suddenly become like it's cancel culture, isn't it? You suddenly become like an enemy of people just for like not fitting to like these people's like idea of like a perfect world, in a sense. And it's yeah, to me it seems like it's getting a lot stronger as time goes on. And obviously, you've read Coddling the American Mind, um, and yeah.
Well, yeah, that Coddling of the American Mind by Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt is another book that we've earmarked to just talk about, haven't we? Because and
Yeah.
I think it probably deserves an episode in and of itself. But they have, I mean, one of the things that I thought when I was reflecting on man's search for meaning. So
Yeah.
there's probably the most famous quote that comes from the entire book, although it's usually short, paraphrased slightly from what I will give, because I like to give the full thing. It says, "We who lived in concentration camps can remember the men who walked through the huts, comforting others, giving away their last piece of bread. They may have been few in number, but they offer sufficient proof that everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way." And
Yeah.
I was reflecting on that quote, and I've heard it a lot, when a little while ago I was doing a fair bit of research on obsessive compulsive disorder and anxiety disorders because of a client I was working with. I felt I needed to educate myself better on those particular issues, and I listened to a fairly significant number of podcasts with um, experts in that field, also sufferers of OCD, and life coaches, and people who had experience of it and knowledge of it. And that quote probably came up about 3 or 4 times in the fortnight to a month that I was heavily researching this topic. And to me, that is one of the principles that underpins cognitive behavioral therapy. It's because
Yeah.
the idea of CBT is that you can adjust the way your mind reacts to your circumstance. So we can notice negative thought patterns and we can go, okay, we're going to try and see if we can identify those negative thought patterns, analyze them, and learn to react differently. And so this idea that we can choose our reaction to a given set of circumstances basically underpins CBT. And what the basic premise of the coddling of the American mind was that many things in our current society are an inverse of the CBT model, in that they are reinforcing cognitive distortions such as, the world is a dangerous place. And then rather than when someone, so to use the trigger warning example that you brought up, someone is in a heightened state of feeling sensitive to threat, and that threat sensitivity is hypothetically triggered by some interaction. And rather than saying you need to work on that heightened level of threat sensitivity, the reaction and the use of trigger warnings and so on is more about saying you are justified. Those are rational thoughts you're having, and you should be, well, they obviously, the title of the book is The Coddling of the American Mind, so to some degree they're saying you should be coddled and protected from this danger. Whereas because I would describe Viktor Frankl as an existentialist, and I know I'm far from alone in that. And one of the fundamental existentialist propositions is that there is a suffering inherent in life, and that voluntary exposure to that suffering can make us stronger and make us better able to deal with it. And this is, the Nietzschean thing that I mentioned earlier of he who has a why can withstand any how. And it's basically that idea that, it was another Nietzschean dictum that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And so, yeah, I definitely see what you're saying. And again, it's not a unique observation that there are aspects of our society that have changed to reinforce cognitive distortions and to have an reverse CBT effect. Sorry?
Yeah. I just said victim mentality.
Yeah. Well, there's an interesting sociology book by Bradley Campbell and Jason Manning. I hope I've got that right. It might be no, I'm pretty sure it's Bradley Campbell and Jason Manning. For a second I thought I had their first names the wrong way round. But it's called The Rise of Victimhood Culture, and they basically document a number of different. I read it alongside The Coddling of the American Mind, and I think it was very interesting to read them alongside each other, because one's coming from a psychological perspective, and the other's coming from a sociological perspective. But they're basically tackling the same issue to some degree, and they were speaking about different cultures, and they brought up an honor culture, a dignity culture, and what they termed a victimhood culture. So what distinguished each of those and what gave them their title is what is socially rewarded or achieved. What do you have to gain social status? So in an honor culture, they're very sensitive. They would characterize it as being very sensitive to slight, and you have this concept of honor, which has to be earned and can be taken away by someone else. So, if someone insults you, they are taking away some of your honor, and therefore you get things like duels to regain your honor. And they quite often lead to a lot of violence, because there's also within them, honor cultures tend to develop in places where you have poor access to reliable sort of authority. So maybe you don't have a very functional legal system, maybe rural areas, maybe areas with sort of failing states. So you don't have a legal system that can resolve any of the problems. So there's no authority to appeal to. And also it'd be seen as shameful to appeal to authority. So you see that within gang culture to some degree, and the concerns around snitching. And then you have a dignity culture, which dignity is something that's inherent in the human being and cannot be taken away from anyone. And that is where you get sayings like sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. And that's basically, I'm a dignified human being regardless. And this was, and still is to some degree, the dominant culture within the Western world. You tend to find honor cultures more often outside of the Western world, but that'll vary quite a lot place to place. And then victimhood culture. So in a dignity culture and in an honor culture, we respect people who have either honor or dignity.
Yeah.
And in a victimhood culture, sorry, I'm just realizing I didn't explain a bit of dignity culture, but in dignity culture, because it can't be taken away by someone else, you're not very sensitive to slight. So someone can insult you and you go, well, I'm not going to stoop to your level. I'm going to walk away and keep my dignity intact, because you can only lose your dignity through your own actions and behaviors. And dignity culture tends to encourage people to resolve problems without appeals to authority, but has to have a reliable source of authority behind it, so that people feel that there is a way of resolving their issues without having to have duels and such, should they not be able to resolve them themselves. And then the victimhood culture, they termed so because victimhood is given social status. And it includes the sensitivity to slight. So insults are, you get this concept that words are violence. It tends to rely very heavily on postmodernist theory that posits that the world is formed by words, and that so words have this significant amount of power. And while I agree that there is a significant value in clear and considered speech, and that, I'm a big believer in free speech because I do think words have power, I don't think words define reality. I think there are objective realities beyond the semantic. And whereas this sort of relies on the idea of words of violence, they would use things like trigger warnings, which is basically saying, you should consider the potential of being upset by this to some degree. You're almost implanting the idea in people's minds that they should be upset. But unlike an honor culture, which is also sensitive to slight, a victimhood culture requires a strong authority, because they also tend to appeal to authority, which is why, as you observed, cancel culture, there is an appeal to authorities to remove anything that could be offensive. The person who is seen as the victim is held as the most important person in every conversation. And, you see it in hate speech laws, which have been used to prosecute people who've made jokes. You see it currently, I think in Ireland, a teacher has just been arrested for not using someone's preferred pronouns. You get many different examples, And you see it in some of the protests against speakers. There's this idea that all speech that may offend someone needs to be kept away, and actually that violence is justified on the part of the victim, or the defined or perceived victim. And so that was an interesting way of understanding it. I don't think you haven't read that book, have you?
Which one?
The Rise of Victimhood Culture.
No.
No.
Yeah. Sounds interesting though.
Yeah. Well, sociology is a field with many issues. It has been the source of much derision over the years, but there are some people doing very good work, and that book was very well evidenced, and they were very careful in the conclusions they were drawing from the information, and they even went to a great effort to anticipate the potential criticisms of their work and what they've done, and basically to invite those criticisms and say, this is a discussion, we need to know it more. But it sounds like it's basically describing what you were describing then, in terms of seeing people. I can't remember how you phrased it now.
Neither can I.
Sorry, I spoke too long, but
It's all good.
Yeah, tracking back. What did you say? You said about basically. Oh, you were positing that that this stems from a lack of meaning from people. I believe that you don't feel people have a sense of meaning, and therefore that is impacting on people's mental health, and therefore that's contributing to the rise of victimhood culture. Does that sound about right, or is that an inaccurate summary of what you were thinking?
I think that's an accurate summary, but I think there is definitely a possibility that is the case. I can't remember the origin of it, but yeah, no, I mean, like, I think there's to be fair, that's actually a fairly good point, because I think a big part of it is that people need to find meaning, and they tend to find meaning at the moment, since children are on social media from like really young ages. They end up in like forums on pages like Tumblr and stuff like that, and like Reddit and all sorts, and you have so many different like subcategories and all this stuff, and people just like try and fit in different places. And when you start being told like, oh, if your parent speaks down to you or something like that, they're like an abusive parent, they like try and sort of develop this victim mentality to then make them feel included within like within the forums and online, basically. So I suppose there is definitely an element of people searching for meaning online and then going down these paths of just ending up in like these horrible mentalities of trying to find reasons that they're being like a victim, basically.
Well, there's another relevant quote from it, and I actually have I have some additions to that on the role that the social media plays in it. But there's another quote that feels relevant, which is, "Life is never made unbearable by circumstances, but by lack of meaning and purpose." That was from Man's Search for Meaning again, and I think that that is definitely playing a part. And I know that John Vervaeke has spoken about there being a meaning crisis. And I mean, Jordan Peterson has spoken along those lines. And I think in some ways his rise to fame, to the degree that he has, is proof of that, because a lot of what he speaks about is based around meaning and finding meaning and taking personal responsibility and personal growth, despite how his detractors mischaracterize him so often. his general message is to everyone, you need to fix up and be better. And so what I think has happened to some degree, the hypothesis that I was working on about the developmental fixation at the stage at which you still expect the world to adjust to you, I think one of the things that has facilitated that becoming, I mean, there are a number of things that facilitate it, but one thing that contributes to it is social media, because prior to social media, we were in a situation where you would have to interact with the people within your local vicinity. It wasn't possible to selectively choose your social networks to the same degree. And so you would have an inherent diversity of thoughts, opinions, perspectives, values that you would have to interact with on a regular basis. But as social interaction has moved more and more online, it becomes easier to cultivate a echo chamber as a social circle. And so rather than interacting with people who disagree with you and having to take it seriously, you can only communicate with people who share the same viewpoint as you. And I think this contributes to things like flat earthers, for example. You know, if you had a flat earther in your social group 20 years ago, they would get made fun of, and people would basically use hazing to pressure them into sort of going, oh, actually, maybe being the only person in the entire town who believes in flat earth when everyone else doesn't, and everything like that would make them question themselves more. Whereas now they can go online and find some people who validate that perspective. And even if you are still interacting with people off of a of different perspectives, different values, then you only need so many people, because humans are so prone to confirmation bias. You know, we want to hear what confirms us. Another one of Jonathan Haidt's books, The Righteous Mind, which I'm going to be speaking about with someone else at some point, is based, part of the book is based on one of his papers called the Intuitive Dog and His Rational Tail, where basically he showed that people come to their moral positions intuitively, and then they rationalize them after the fact. And the way he did this was he created a number of stories that would deliberately create a moral response in people. And then, but he would put details into these stories that remove the justification for them thinking it's immoral. And then he would question them on it, and people would be really unwilling to change their minds. And what he basically said from this was that people are intuitively coming to a moral position and then they're rationalizing it after the fact, but that we're really, really bad at trying to prove ourselves wrong. And, you know, you're probably familiar with confirmation bias as a concept, because we always look for things that confirm us. And so if you imagine you've got this position, I'll keep using the flat earthers as an example. If you think that the earth is flat and no one around you does, then there's a reasonable amount of pressure, but you're still going to be looking for evidence to confirm yourself naturally, because that's what most people do. Oh, well, it's what everyone does, apart from well-trained scientists, and even then they get it wrong. But what you then, if you have 2 or 3 people that you're speaking to online that agree with you, it doesn't matter if there's 20 people in real life who are disagreeing with you, you've got enough confirmation there to reinforce your ideas. And then over time, you get these polarized bubbles that aren't interacting with each other. And when they are interacting with each other, it's usually just to deride each other and not to actually, not with any, even a pretense of being willing to change their mind. So that's sort of like the way I see social media playing its role in it. I think that a lack of meaning drives people to derive their meaning from these ideas and these identities that are partially socially constructed, but then there's no self-correcting force in the social network because you now have a social network that's just continuously self-reinforcing.
Yeah, yeah, that pretty much like I think it's just it is definitely gotten to the point now where I say now, it's probably gotten to this point for a long time, that it's just it's too easy to find people that agree with you. There's so many people in the world, so many people on the internet, that no matter what sort of fucked up idea you have, there's gonna be people out there that will agree with you, or people that are easily convinced to like side with you. And like you said, you only need like a few people to actually sort of activate that idea of I'm right, I know this is a good idea, no matter how bad it is. Like it is, yeah, and people just love to latch onto it because it is when you're being, I suppose, when you're being confirmed by other people, like, and even if your idea is like really out there, even if one person says it, that sort of gives you meaning. So it's like, right, I've now got a purpose. I can like run with this, or like I now belong in this sort of like group. So it's very easy for people to get, I suppose, carried away with it because the idea in the book is like once you have meaning, you can go survive anyhow or whatever. So I suppose when people find meaning in whatever sort of area online, um, they feel like they belong and they don't want to let it go like at all. So they will fight and fight for that sort of meaning, even if it's like, I don't know, you have people that do some really fucked up shit online, so that's sort of like evidence of that. But yeah,
Yeah, um, I think it's very hard to want to challenge something that your identity is based on, right? If you're the
yeah.
so the more your identity relies on your beliefs, the harder it's going to be for you to change your mind on them.
Well, look at the whole situation with like uh politics online. Since politics has been moved to like being pretty much just an argument online, and you've got social media deliberately like pinning people against each other in it, and to try and get people to sort of like interact more and boost like posts. People spend more time on Facebook when they're angry than when they're like happy, basically.
Yeah.
And it's like they, as soon as you're just like, I know I went through it when Jeremy Corbyn was running and everything. I got really sucked into the whole like left wing side of stuff, and I still believe in a lot of it, and I still believe there's a lot of shit spread, but um, that's besides the point. But I literally got sucked into it to the point where I spent most of my time arguing with people on Facebook about stuff that like realistically all I've done is read a few articles. I like try and confirm my thoughts and stuff like that, but at the end of the day, all I'm doing is getting some information from someone else and then arguing with this person online who's done exactly the same thing but got different information. So like for probably about like 6 months, my whole meaning of life was just smoking weed and arguing with people on Facebook about fucking stuff that I literally knew nothing about. And I didn't want to let it go. And it genuinely really affected my mental health. Like I got to the point where I was just fucking miserable because all I was doing was just like experiencing all this negative stuff, but I didn't want to let it go. And it got to the point where I was just like, I'm either gonna like argue to the point where I'm so depressed and so angry I have like a heart attack, like my blood pressure would just go through the roof and I'd just like die, or I needed to like give it up. And like that's a pretty like extreme point to get to for just like a sort of belief in a political party, or like not even a political party, and just like one bloke. And yeah, it took a lot, and I re-downloaded Facebook time and time again, and I kept getting caught back into it. It took me a while to get to the point where I wasn't arguing with people when I was going online, and now I'm just like, I don't see any point in it now, and I don't know why I saw point in it back then, but for some reason I found meaning in it, and I just ran with it. And no matter how many times people told me but people like unfriended me and things like that. Like people I'd hang out with on like a daily basis in like my social circle unfriended me and unfollowed me on Facebook because I was just a fucking annoying cunt, basically.
Well, I also have struggled with, so one of the things that you were saying earlier is that you derived your meaning from having a goal to pursue. And one of the neurobiological systems that we have, the reward system, rewards us for pursuing a goal by releasing dopamine. And you get a small hit of dopamine every time you make progress towards the goal. And this is to, ensure that you're following through and doing your goals because you feel good at them. And your goals could be getting food, getting shelter, procreating, all these different things that are basically fundamental to survival. And so one of the things that social media does is that it triggers little hits of dopamine when you're using it as well. So you're getting little rewards from that. And so it would be easy on a neurobiological level, I'd imagine, to confuse interactions with social media with a genuine source of meaning. But because it's not providing you with the end reward, there is no sort of achievement or overall progression. It's just the illusion of progression. You are going to suffer because you're not getting what you need to from pursuing that specific goal. And I've been through that phase of arguing with people on the internet. And
So,
I sorry.
I just want to say something before you carry on. So,
Yeah.
do you think if Jeremy Corbyn got into power and that was like the end goal, that it would be different and I'd still be pursuing the arguing on Facebook? I think that's a pretty interesting sort of possibility of just like, if it actually came to it and he got into power, would I still be an asshole online?
Well,
Or
there's a chance that if Jeremy Corbyn was in power, we wouldn't have any power for you to be online. So, um, and I'm being slightly hyperbolic there, but I look at what's happened in Canada with Justin Trudeau, and I am very grateful for the bullet we dodged. And I think that particularly with the current energy crisis, the idea of someone being in charge who would be committed to net zero above all else would be very concerning, and someone who wanted to socialize everything. It to me, like from an economic perspective, I think we would be in a far worse position for that. But that's that. You are.
I said you never know.
You can make a reasonably well-educated guess, but that's a bit of a tangent. So it may be that had he got into power, you would feel that your actions were justified and achieved what they were intended to, and so it may have enabled you to sustain that for longer. But I suspect it would come unraveled anyway, whether that's because you become disillusioned with Jeremy Corbyn not creating the utopia in the blink of an eye, or because you would then be directionless because it turned out that getting Jeremy Corbyn elected isn't a good source of meaning for you in your life anyway, for all the impact you could have on the election. But one of the things that I have developed, because I also went through the thing of deleting Facebook fairly regularly, And I went without Facebook for ages, and it's only because of having a podcast I now have to have social media again. And I find myself getting sucked in. It's very hard to have a healthy relationship with social media. But I've gotten very good at, I'll see something, I'll be tempted to argue with it, and I will go, I'll use quite often I'll write the message, and then I'll sit there before I press send thinking, does the message get across the point I want to convey? Then I might word it a little better. Then I go, is it going to be received the way I want it to be? And then I think about it, and I usually go, probably not. And I go, am I going to gain anything from sending this message that's positive, or am I just going to get abuse and arguments that are then going to make me irate? And probably at some point I'm going to do myself a disservice anyway, because I'll get overtaken by my emotions and my desire to win, and I'll start saying things that are deliberately inflammatory. And so I've gotten very good at just deleting that message and walking away from it and choosing my moments where I think it might be useful, where I think there's a real chance that someone might listen, and that there might be a good conversation. Because I'm not saying that I know the answer. You know, I want to have a conversation and put across my perspective and get theirs back and see if we can progress together. But if me having an alternative perspective to them is just going to lead to an argument, then that's not going to happen, is it? I'm not going to benefit from that. So I choose my moments now. I still get it wrong sometimes. I get sucked in, but not very often. And it's been useful. I also try to use a bit more satire, so it doesn't inherently end up confrontational. Like, I think I posted something genuine for the first time in ages, not long after the Queen died, saying, I think I said, we're the virtuous ones, claim group of people celebrating the death of their ideological opponents. And it got ignored by pretty much everyone. There was a couple of people who commented, but that's fine. You know, I made my point. I made it in a jokey way, so that like that, and I don't need the reward of people interacting. Anyway, I've gone off on a tangent, but yeah, I can see that relationship with social media and the need to. Are you laughing at me because I tangent every 10 seconds?
Yeah, pretty much.
It's just tangents on top of tangents on top of tangents, but it is all relevant. You know, the tangents I go on do they all connect in my head, but I'm quite a lateral thinker, you know, like different things linked to each other. So I tend to see things in that way. But one of the attributes of sort of what you've been describing in terms of cancel culture and what the things we spoke about in victimhood culture is that the ideologies is that they tend to reduce the world into good and evil, and there's a real passion for or passion there seems to be a real zeal for highlighting people as wrong and evil in some way, usually for having a different perspective on something. And I feel there's another appropriate quote here, and I'm going to run out on my list of ones that I've written down. But he said, no man should judge unless he asks himself in absolute honesty whether in a similar situation he might not have done the same. And that is basically a play on the biblical idea of judge not lest ye be judged yourself. And it was also mirrored in Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago when he spoke of the guards at the Gulag camps, where he basically said, you know, I remember them coming into my school and trying to recruit people to work at the gulags, and saying in a different set of circumstances it could just have easily been me. And that's when he went on to say that he learned his lesson, that the line between good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. And so I think it speaks to a very profound and meaningful truth, and I don't think it's a coincidence that that's come up in so many different iterations over time, in so many different circumstances. That is a lesson that people are learning when faced with genuine suffering.
Yeah, it's funny actually because that is because I've always said something very similar, maybe not as well worded as that, but because I've got a lot of friends who, well, I had a lot of friends throughout the time who had passed judgment on um, a lot of people, basically, like pretty much anyone. That's what young people do. Um, but yeah, especially around like homeless people in various different settings, specifically Bristol, when I used to go there a lot. Um, there's a lot of like judgment on how they lived and why they're in the situation that they did. And it's not exactly the same thing because it's not like they're, I don't know, beating people or whatever. Well, they might be, but um, it's more the fact that it's very easy to cast judgment without actually thinking about how their life is or what has led them to their situation and what they've done. And I think it's very blatant across most of society that people have lacked, I suppose, the ability to be empathetic to people that they don't understand, because they just overlook the numerous different things that could have led them to exactly the same position that this other person is in. And it's something that, like, I don't know why I've always sort of tried to be empathetic and think how that person ended up in that situation or why they're doing what they're doing. Um, but whenever I see or whenever I'm with someone who like judges people like that, I always try and like point them in that direction. It's like you don't know why they're in that situation, and if you were in that situation, you don't know that you wouldn't have done any differently, basically.
Well, I think that empathy aspect is almost definitely biologically instantiated, because I think we all within our family tend to lean to the high levels of compassion, um, and that tends to be quite often so quite often that empathy comes out, or empathy is most frequently spoken about sort of with regards to the dispossessed in society. So like the homeless, like those who have suffered or experiencing difficulty in the most visible ways. But what I think, or what I've tried to do in recent years, is to expand that circle of compassion, because when you've got an ideological framework surrounding it, you end up with this idea of good and evil, and that some people are good and some people are evil, and that your compassion should only be expanded to the group of people who are good. And actually, quite often, when you have that framework, you are not necessarily empathizing with people who would be considered all that good, because, like you say, for example, you have empathy for the homeless, which I often do, but you could also be empathizing with empathizing with them just on the basis that they're homeless is not a great idea, because there's also quite possibly a side to them that is violent or abusive or has done something in their past that is not deserving of not a virtuous trait that we want to be elevating as something. But there's also a demonization on the other side, like the demonization of the rich, for example, um, or the demonization of conservatives. And people who tend to demonize those two groups tend to paint them as one and the same, which makes no sense given that the conservatives keep getting elected, which means the majority of our country votes conservative. But and the fact that the people who constitute the rich is a very transient group, and it depends on whether you base it on wealth or yearly income, because they're two completely different things. There's all these different complications to it, and so what I have tried to do over the years is to expand my circle of compassion to um, encapsulate everyone, but not unconditionally. You know, it encapsulates the good in everyone while leaving room to be critical of the bad in everyone. And that goes back to the Solzhenitsyn, you know, the line between good and evil existing in everyone. And for an example of that, I really recommend, I think I recommended it to you the other day, actually. There's Ordinary Men by Christopher Browning, which is about a reserve police battalion in Nazi Germany. So, and this is the other side of the fence from Viktor Frankl, really, in a very literal as well as a metaphorical sense. These were sort of middle class police officers from Hamburg in Germany who had no real, they didn't sign up to fight with the Nazis or anything like that, but they were drafted to help with minor jobs like not involved in the mass killings, but maybe clearing out ghettos and so on. And they were basically really uncomfortable with the work they were being asked to do, but they did it out of a self-reported feeling of duty to the other people, not to let them down. And when it came time for the first time they were called upon to kill people, their commander basically said, "Look, what we've been asked to do is not something that I feel comfortable asking you to do, and so everyone who doesn't want to do this can walk away." And it was something like 20% of them walked away, and then another few walked away throughout the act when they realized they couldn't do it. But then what you see is a progression over time where less and less people are walking away, and these people who are very reluctant and are traumatized by what they're doing because they're going back and they're drinking every night, they hardly speak to each other because it's so difficult. But over time they become increasingly desensitized to this, and are carrying out these mass killings on a regular basis. And these are ordinary people who had they weren't completely captured by the ideology. They had a conscience, they had a sense of loyalty and duty, and they basically had these different aspects of themselves pitted against each other by circumstance, and they had to make a decision, and that's what they ended up doing. And it's very hard to read that and not put yourself in the shoes of someone who may be classified by others who reduce the world to simpler terms as evil. And so I no longer, I think the message that you shouldn't judge people has to be extended to everyone, or it doesn't work.
I mean, it really depends on well, no, I agree with you that it should be extended to everyone, but it really does depend on how you define judging someone. Like, I think it's, for me anyway, it's putting unnecessary negative, like, connotations, I suppose, on a person that you don't know. So, but then you've also got the element of judging people in a positive light. I don't know. I think it really does depend on how you define like judging people. Is it just like instant judgment, or is it judgment when you know what that person's sort of like, in a sense? Because
Well, yeah. So there needs to be a. You're right. Actually, we should definitely be more careful about how we define judging someone, because people who claim they don't judge people are also lying, if depending on how they use it, because we all pass judgments, you know, like right now my eyes are focused on the laptop at the expense of everything else, and that's a form of judgment because I'm discriminating against the other two monitors behind it or the glass over there, you know, that is a form of, and we make rapid judgments because those heuristics are the way that we navigate the world, and we don't have the time or the capacity. That we just don't have the processing power to analyze everything in its complete detail. But so I guess what we mean by not passing judgment is more about looking to understand someone before you concretize that judgment.
Yeah. I agree with you that it definitely needs to be cast across everyone, because otherwise you're just being biased at the end of the day. And like, obviously one of the, well, I don't know if it's a goal for everyone, but one of my goals personally is to be as least biased as possible, which obviously humans are naturally biased, but yeah, I think it is definitely, yeah, I definitely agree with you on that one. What was the quote with basically you've always got the you can take everything away from a man, but you've always got the ability to choose.
Do you want the paraphrased version or the whole one?
Give me the whole one. Fuck it.
Okay. So we who lived in concentration camps can remember the men who walked through the huts, comforting others and giving away their last piece of bread. They may have been few in number, but they offer sufficient proof that everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way.
Yeah, so there's I after reading this again like recently, I started thinking about that, because something that I've been faced with a lot of debates with my friends is that I personally believe that humans have the ability to do exactly that and choose their attitude, not just their attitude, but also like um, choose how they think about certain situations. And I
Yeah.
get a lot of backlash from this because I believe that even though emotions are almost instant and we get emotions like come up for various reasons, like emotional triggers and stuff like that. But I believe that we have the choice to either believe the emotions on their initial upbringing, basically, or not. And everyone I seem to speak to disagrees with me and thinks that emotions should be believed because they are felt and emotions are true, and that basically we don't have a choice to feel certain emotions, which I agree with, because obviously you do have like emotional triggers, like you have emotions that are brought up by the past, but I believe that we've got a choice to act on those emotions, and we have in any given situation a choice to basically decide how we act. And I seem to get a lot of backlash from that, and I'm just wondering what your opinions on that is.
Well, I think there's a tendency of people to talk in absolute terms on any given topic, you know. So the way you're describing that to me sounds like these people are interpreting you as saying, in absolute terms, you can control your every reaction, whereas they, or at least the way you're representing them, and they may be coming across like this, but not necessarily intending to, is they're saying in absolute terms, emotions are real and valid and accurate and must be listened to.
Yeah.
And like everything, the truth exists somewhere in the middle. Um, we do have emotions and we have reactions to stuff, and the time it takes for our brain to process an emotional reaction is a fraction of the time it takes to reach the point of our brain that processes the logical and rational reaction. So emotions always come first, just by the structure of our brain. So you have the sensory input, emotional reaction, and then sometime later you have rational. But when I'm saying sometime later, we're talking a delay of like a few seconds. We're not talking hours. But that doesn't mean that we just have to give in to our emotions and that our emotions are inherently right. Again, I go back to the idea of CBT, which is basically saying that your instinctive thought patterns are disadvantaging you because they are hindering your interactions with the world. They're making life more difficult for you. Let's see if we can adjust those reactions. And you can train your emotional reactions. And you train yourself to be less reactive and more considered and less enslaved to your emotions. And meditation is great for this, because if you spend if you spend enough time meditating, I would recommend something like 15 to 20 minutes a day. But if you spend 15 to 20 minutes a day meditating, you get into this position where you are very aware of changes in your body and you recognize the lack of clear distinction between body and mind. I had this thought actually the other day while I was meditating, ironically. And this thought just popped into my head really quickly, and I sort of put it to one side until I was done. That we often talk about there's this sort of phrase, mind, body, soul. And the distinction between mind and body, at least from a materialist perspective, is a questionable one in and of itself, because our mind is part of our body, and they're so connected and interdependent that to distinguish between them is to me, we go back to that vagueness. What is the line between the mind and the body? If the mind is what controls my fingers moving, then how do I distinguish between those? Because without my mind, they're just inanimate fingers. They're just lumps of flesh and bone that don't do anything. And is a finger defined by its function? That's another question we can avoid for now, because it'll kind of lead to a long analysis. But I just wanted to bring it up to illustrate that point. And so what I sort of developed this skill through work initially, and meditation has helped me to understand it more, and discussing meditation with other people who meditate who didn't have the skill already. But you can get very good at recognizing signs of a reaction coming within your own body. So, like, I can notice in a situation if my heart rate quickens, or if my jaw gets slightly tighter, or I can feel a feeling in the pit of my stomach that I know means I'm starting to feel anxious. So, like, there's loads of different cues, and you can become increasingly sensitive to them. So you see the warning signs that this is starting to rise up. And then you can get good at controlling the degree to which you react emotionally. So and you see this development of emotional regulation in children. If you look at the research on developmental aggression, children are at their most aggressive, or people are at their most aggressive at about 2 years old, once they have the coordination to throw a punch and a kick. And it's sort of like an original sin thing, because people argue that, particularly people who are very wholeheartedly believe in the social constructionist sort of side of things, that we are taught to be aggressive, we're taught to be violent, but the research indicates the opposite way. We start off violent, although it's still only a percentage of children. The majority are not violent, and over the longer you go on, so throughout their lifespan, people get less and less violent at pretty much the same rate, and it's just an exceptionally violent few who continue, but they still decrease their frequency of their violence. And that's why you get stats like it's something like 6% of criminals commit 50% of the crime, or something like that.
80-20 rule, isn't it?
Sorry?
80-20 rule.
The
like 20
Pareto distribution.
Hmm?
Yeah, it's a Pareto distribution where a small percentage of people do all of the crime, just like a small percentage of people are responsible for all the productivity and responsible for a small percentage of everything is responsible for a large percentage of the output. Like there are very few things that don't follow that seemingly natural rule. But so what happens is we are socialized out of our aggression. We learn to control that emotional reaction. We learn to control that instinctive reaction. And few people would argue that we should just leave children to react aggressively because that's their emotions. Those are real. Those are what they feel, and so that's what should happen. And I know that to some degrees that sounds like a reductio ad absurdum, but I'm just using it as an example for how we can learn our way out of these strong emotional reactions. So, what Viktor Frankl is talking about in this situation is obviously the concentration camps. It's a prolonged period. So he's gone past the emotional reaction. You know, the emotional reaction is the first, say it comes on within 2-3 seconds, and then it takes an hour to dissipate, which is a very long time for an emotional reaction to dissipate. But let's just say, for argument's sake, it takes an hour. He then has a long period for reflection and deciding how he's going to react. And some people some people within the concentration camp. One of the things that was interesting about this book, actually, that isn't usually represented very often when we hear the narratives, and I actually remember speaking with a friend, a Jewish friend, about this book, and her saying how grateful she was for the fact that they included these details, because she felt there was a bit of a myth of the noble Jew who just accepted their fate without complaining and things like that. But actually, he describes in the book how people in the concentration camps would rob each other, extort each other. People would pull tricks to make sure someone else was getting taken to the extermination, taken to be exterminated rather than them, and so on. So there is this fight, and he was basically saying, but there are some people who said, you know, despite all my circumstances, I am going to work to support others. I'm going to work to make this less unbearable for myself and for other people. I will share my limited food even though I'm starving. I will comfort those who are upset. And they answered their call to moral responsibility in that situation. And so that's sort of what he's talking about. But I think over the long term, you can take responsibility. You can choose to take responsibility for your emotional reactions. So yes, you might not be able to control the fact that you lost your temper in that moment, because that was just a product of increased levels of cortisol in a quick period of time before you were able to give any consideration to it. But you can say, I'm going to learn from that. I'm going to do my best to make sure that doesn't happen again. I'm going to take responsibility for my emotional reaction. And so you're still choosing how you respond to that set of circumstances over a longer time scale. And one of the things that I found very interesting in this book was that, aside from the sort of charitable side of things that he's talking about, the supporting people, things like that, he's saying one of the ways in which people coped with it, and one of the things that gave people resilience and strength, was humor. And he's a big advocate for people being able to laugh in the face of their circumstances, and people making jokes about the situation they're in, no matter how grim it is. And I suspect, well, actually, before we go off on the humor thing, do you feel that that's a sufficient answer to your question? Do you feel like it kind of clarifies things? Do you feel like I'm talking ish?
Yeah, I mean, you pretty much just sort of agreed with my thought processes in a whole, pretty much. Like, yeah, I sort of think about it in some way. The one thing I would say is that I've literally just thought of this, is that the people in the concentration camp who are doing nice things and helping the other people, that is probably their search for meaning. Like that is probably the meaning that they've like gathered in the whole scenario, and they're just like, I'm going to help other people because that gives them meaning, and then that they can like proceed to, yeah.
Well, that is what Viktor Frankl was talking about, really. You know, that was them getting their why. They answered their call to moral responsibility. That gave them their why, and therefore they could withstand their own circumstances. And he used a beautiful phrase in it where he said that he strived to be worthy of his suffering. And that phrase, to be worthy of your suffering, was just mind blowing to me. You know, it's so profound because he was basically like, suffering is a gift because in the face of suffering you have a calling to moral responsibility, to moral action. You know, you have to, this is your opportunity where you can find meaning, you find the why that enables you to withstand those hows. And he basically, yeah, so one has to become worthy of one's suffering.
It sounds similar to basically what David Goggins says, is that you basically need to, if you want to have value in your suffering, then you basically need to find meaning within it, like meaning to, like, why are you suffering, like can you basically making the most out of it. Like if you're suffering for a reason, why are you suffering, how can you benefit from it, how can you like flip it around and make it like beneficial for you, part of your growth journey, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, and David Goggins is someone who really likes suffering.
Yeah, he's an man. It's nuts.
So I think the humor thing is interesting because I think the humor thing is something, it's probably a heritable thing to be honest, but I think that the use of humor is something to deal with adversity, is something that is definitely I can see present within our entire family. Um, you know, me and you both definitely have a dark sense of humor at times, and I I actually remember getting into a debate with someone a little while ago. And it was really bizarre, actually. There was this big group debate, and someone told someone off for making a joke. And I basically said, well, people make jokes as a way of dealing with things. Um, and I said, you know, I work in an environment where we are face to face with some of the most horrendous things that happen in our society on a fairly regular basis. You know, children being abused, domestic violence, um, rape, sexual abuse, all these different things that we have to deal with. And um, and social workers have some of the darkest sense of humours I've ever known, and all the teams that I've known that manage to retain their staff and that function well and healthy and in a supportive way have really dark senses of humour. And this person said to me, "It might be a coping mechanism, but that doesn't make it healthy." And I was disappointed in my inability to come up with a response in that moment, but I also don't think it would have been necessarily that productive. But reading Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl is basically making the opposite case, that humor is one of the means by which we transcend our suffering. Is that something that you feel is accurate to your life? Am I making an accurate observation?
Yeah, yeah, 100%. Like I have used humor to support all of my suffering, in a sense, like from uh even when I took way too much AMT and I ended up with chest pains, I still found humor in it by like a um random research chemical online, and basically just like overdo it and like fuck myself up. I made plenty of jokes about that. Mum wasn't too happy about it. When I was going to prison, like the fucking lead up to the prison sentence was like 6 months before. I was constantly making jokes about it, and so are you. Um, and yeah,
I
it
wasn't
definitely
happy
helped.
about that either.
No, well, I still make jokes about it. She's still not happy about it. Um, but yeah, and even when I was in prison, it was like I remember the first day that I fucking woke up in that cell, and I was like, oh, for fuck's sake, the Valium had worn off, and I had to face reality. Um, and I got out of my cell, and basically, like everyone who got sentenced with me just like crowded into like one cell. There's like 10 of us in there, and we were all just like making cups of tea and just cracking jokes and just like fucking having a laugh, and like it just like instantly made me feel so much better. And like throughout the whole time I was there, I was making jokes about it. When I was depressed, I make jokes about fucking suicide and things like that. It's helped me get through like all of the fucking hardest parts of my life, and it still does now. And I fucking it's a really good like connection point with people as well. Like if I can find other people who can joke about their own suffering, or like joke about suffering in general, um, then like I can really connect with them like quite easily, because I just like, right, you understand it, and like yeah, I just run with it. It's great. I'm not even sure if I'd really. I suppose it is a coping mechanism at the end of the day. Like you are using it to try and um, make a situation just like more positive in a sense. But it's the same way of like looking at positive versus negative thinking. Like if you go to therapy and stuff like that and think really negatively, like they try and they give you ways to sort of like direct your thoughts into a more positive area, because like at the end of the day, like a lot of negative thoughts are cognitive distortions like catastrophizing and black and white thinking and things like that. Um, so like yeah, I don't see it any different to the idea of like switching like negative thoughts to like positive ones. I think it's just another form of it, which is also fucking hilarious. So it's great.
Yeah, I think it speaks to something that we were talking about earlier, something that's, you know, present in certainly exposure therapy, but also in existentialist thinking anyway, which is like voluntary exposure to something allows you to become stronger and more able to deal with it. And, you know, as someone who suffers with arachnophobia, I can think of like a really clear example of this. I'm not speaking specifically in terms of humor, but if I see like a big spider crawling up my curtain in my bedroom, for example, I will get stressed out, I'll get anxious, you know, I'll have all the emotional, hormonal responses to it. And that gets infinitely worse when I look away from it. Because when I look away from it, I no longer have a frame of reference for the size of that spider or its location. So that spider could then be anywhere, and the anxious part of my brain will make it increasingly big. But whereas if I stay looking at it, the anxiousness eventually dissipates, and I can start to think more rationally, and I can start to take action about it. And now more so than when I was younger, I can go and get a glass, and I can capture them usually and get them out of the house. It's not a pleasant experience or one I enjoy. Uh, Got some buzzing in the background.
I think that's I think that's my fan on my PC, because it's been led on this, so it's getting quite hot.
Okay, well, we'll wrap up pretty soon anyway. But so continuously confronting the fact that that source of anxiety and stress is there in my room enables me to deal with it better. And I think that's all that making a joke is. You are not only are you facing the problem because you're acknowledging that it exists, but you're also undermining its power by making it into a joke. You're trivializing it. It's not this big monster. It's this silly thing, you know. It's not a dragon. It's a little lizard. Like, and
Yeah.
I can think of so many situations. Like I think back to when I was doing the Badger Cull with Holly, for example. We just laughed our way through everything, and we were in positions where we thought we were going to be arrested. We were in positions where we were being chased by people in the middle of nowhere that we didn't know who they were, and they were shining bright torches in on us and things like that. You know, these situations you can, if you don't, if you sort of try and ignore them and you think about them objectively, you're like, well, actually, I maybe could have died in that situation. And you know, no one thinks of being chased at high speeds through flooded country lanes in the middle of the night by a vehicle you can't see because they've got a lamping light shining in your back window and they're driving a few inches from your bumper. No one thinks of that as a safe or enjoyable situation, but we were just making jokes about it, and that enabled me to keep a calm head and deal with the situation as it was. And I never felt overwhelmed by that situation. I think it's humor that enabled that. And it's not like that situation then finished and I had this sudden rush of stress that I'd been trying to ignore or repress. It just wasn't there. Well, that there was some stress there, but not to the level that it would have been were it not for the humor.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a funny story of using humor actually as a sort of defense mechanism. The first time I got arrested, um, there was like 4 or 5 of us that got arrested, and we were all being like processed, and which I just kept like cracking jokes. I can't remember what I was saying, but everyone kept laughing, and the police officer got like really pissed off about it, and he was like, "Do you think this is funny?" And I was just like, not the fact that we got arrested, but like you may as well make the most of it. And he just like he was not fucking happy about it at all. And I just continued to do it, and eventually he separated us, and I was like, oh, now I'm in a cell. I was just like, oh, for fuck's sake, who am I going to joke with now? Just like got nothing to do, couldn't sleep. I was just like, fuck it.
Yeah. Well, I think that the redeeming power of humor is a good positive place to leave it. Plus,
Yeah.
we've been recording for over 2 hours, so
Fucking hell. It goes quick, doesn't it?
yeah, it does that. Right. So, thanks for chatting with me. Let's see if I know how to stop the recording. There we go.